And then there were five. Welcome back to the second episode of the podcast. And thank you for the great support during the first week. We've got listeners from all around the world, from the UK to America to Singapore. So thank you for all the support. And also, remember, we're on a whole host of platforms now. We're on TikTok, we're on Twitter, we're on YouTube, and we're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're everywhere basically now. So thank you all for your reviews and everything you've been doing. So today's episode is practically going to be all about who the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is. In the past week, the leadership race for the next Conservative leader and therefore Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has well and truly kicked off. And now there are five candidates left. They are, in no particular order, Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, a Trade Minister, Tom Tugendhat, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Kemi Badenoch, a former Equalities Minister. So what we're going to do in this episode, me and Nasif, say hello, Nasif.
Hello.
We're going to go through all of the different candidates and a few of their policies, how they're doing, and what their prospects are. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka at the end. Of course, that's a very interesting situation, what's going on over there. But first, it's time for a little game, Nasif. Got a quiz for you. And today, so last week, you had 10 seconds to name as many Conservative MPs as you possibly could. You got 6. Today, I'm going to give you 15 seconds for this one, and you have 15 seconds to name as many UK Prime Ministers as you can. So 3, 2, 1, go.
Winston Churchill, Clement Attlee, Harold Macmillan, Harold Wilson, Stanley Baldwin, Tony Blair, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, and James Callaghan.
Oh, that's all. That's all. That was actually really good. Super fast, I'll tell you that much. You're
Thank you
talking.
very much.
So let me count this up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You got 12. Well done. Going so fast that I was like, oh, I need to quickly jot these down. So 12 prime ministers, very respectable. There's certainly been less than 12 prime ministers in our lifetimes. So, very well done. Very true. All the way from Stanley Baldwin. So, congratulations. So, I think it's time to kick off into episodes. And who are we going to start with? Let's start with Rishi Sunak. So he is currently the most popular with MPs at the moment. He got 101 votes in the last round, and he's got endorsements from Dominic Raab, Grant Shapps, Matt Hancock, Liam Fox, Mark Spencer. So he's certainly got a broad support, and he's almost certain of getting to the final two at this point. Do you agree, Nassif? Do you think he's locked in to get?
I think I would say so. If the vote's going to be from MPs, because I mean the popular vote might not necessarily reflect this, but we're talking about MPs here who are going to vote in the next Conservative leader, and Sunak I feel is very popular, not only because he's been quite relatively uncontroversial over the last few years, but also because, in the eyes of many Conservative MPs, he's been an excellent chancellor in dealing with the finances of the country, and he's one of those MPs who can actually stand up for himself. There have been instances where he actually had to disagree with Boris Johnson on tax cuts and whatnot. And I think ultimately he seems very promising. He seems very civil compared to Johnson. And I think many Conservative MPs will either vote for him because he is uncontroversial, very popular, and they like him for his economics, or probably really just for his personality and for who he is. A bit of a refresher after the Johnson administration.
Definitely. I just want to point out, if you're listening, I don't know if you can hear it, but my neighbour is currently having the chainsaw trying to chop down trees. So I do apologise sincerely. So Rishi Sunak, born in Southampton, former Chancellor up until last week when he resigned in a shock announcement that led to Boris's downfall. And you're right, he is the most popular of MPs, and he is, as you'd say, is relatively uncontroversial. However, he has taken a couple of hits with his wife's non-dom status, him holding a green card. This time from December last year, and like about 2 years before that, he almost seemed locked in to be next Conservative leader. Now he seems a bit, it's a bit icy with the public. Many people feel that he might be out of touch because him and his wife are extremely wealthy. But yeah, we're just going to have to see. He started off his campaign with this very slick video, probably the best campaign video so far, and with the title "Ready for Rishi." I mean, what a campaign slogan! That's beautiful.
What a slogan indeed.
Yeah. I did find this quite humorous. So I know he doesn't have full power. He had to grapple with Boris Johnson, and his disagreements with Boris have been made very public. With Rishi Sunak kind of reminds me a lot of David Cameron and George Osborne trying to be more fiscally responsible rather than tax cuts. Like he's more promoting of raising taxes, and we'll get into that in a second. But one of his slogans is "rebuild the economy," which, as I've said, he didn't have full power as chancellor. But considering he's been chancellor for 2.5 years, trying to rebuild the economy, he was in charge of the economy. I do find that quite funny. So let's go over a few policies of him. So in defense, which has become a bit of a big issue with, of course, the Ukraine situation at the moment, he's committed to maintaining 2% GDP investment, which is the NATO target, and he's called it a floor rather than a ceiling, which is exactly what Boris said recently. So they agree on some things. And he said that the levels of defense spending should be on arbitrary targets, so basically on the severity of the threat. Now there's a more severe threat, so defense spend should be higher than it was a few years ago, for example. He voted leave in 2016, and he currently backs the controversial Northern Ireland Protocol. And he supported Ukraine spending, and as Chancellor oversaw £2.3 billion given to them. But this is his big policy that differentiates himself from other candidates. Every other candidate has promised tax cuts. That's become the defining issue of this campaign. However, he's not done that. His rule is tackle inflation first, grow the economy, and then cut tax. So I'd imagine, because as of recording now, there are 3 debates coming up in the next week, he will very much propose himself as the sensible candidate, saying that, where are these other candidates going to get the money from? Because they either have to, slash the public purse on like public spending on the NHS or any other department, or they have to borrow more money, which risks inflation. So I think that's a bit like I was saying before, David Cameron, George Osborne, trying to be more careful with their finances. But that's his problem. If he wants to be prime minister, while that, in theory could be a more sensible option, that could hold him back from the membership because, as we just said, he'll almost in against the final two. But once the final two is announced, it is decided between the Conservative members. And when compared with other candidates, polls show that he is really lacking behind other candidates. Like almost, I think it was Penny Mordaunt, which is who we're going to talk about next, had almost double his votes in a poll. So that just shows really. I guess there's another question with him. Do you think he's tainted by Boris's legacy, or do you think he's so like adrift from it, and based on like how their arguments have been made public, do you think he risks that image, being in the most senior position behind Boris in the cabinet for the past 3 years?
I mean, what an interesting question, but perhaps a very pertinent one. Um, I think, Sunak, having been involved with Boris's government, could risk being tainted by Boris's sort of actions in the way in which he led the country. But I think when people look back at Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister, they really focus on Boris and
Mm.
Boris. That most that or at least in the minds of many people who I've met and with whom I've spoken about um, um, current day politics, they seem to think that, regardless of whether they are Labour supporting or Conservative or whatever part of the political spectrum they've come from, it's always that the problems with the Johnson premiership were always about Boris Johnson, and
Mm.
that his other chancellors, however idiotic, quote unquote, they may have been, were ultimately led to be so because of Johnson. And I think Sunak might be in that camp. He does somewhat risk, um, you know, his candidacy to his legacy as part of the Boris Johnson government. But considering the fact that, as I mentioned before, he had a few disagreements with Boris, and that he was one of those MPs who actually resigned on account of Boris's lack of leadership, and that now he's presenting himself as something very different that to Boris Johnson. I think
Mm.
ultimately, um, really, people have sort of stopped talking about Boris with regards to the candidates, and I think that includes Rishi. I think if I could really take a guess, I think Sunak is safe from any reputational damage that the Boris Johnson government might have tried to implement on him.
Yeah, actually, when you put it like that, I do think he is safe. Certainly not Nazim Sahari, his successor, who, like, arguably has lost his. I mean, now he's been kicked out of the race. He's lost his place in the leadership election, and arguably that's because he's been tainted by Boris banking on him becoming chancellor, which that was a big risk by him, and it looks as though it hasn't paid out. But I mean, I guess he gets to be chancellor for 2 months at least. So, I mean, he can't complain. That's a big role. But yeah, so Rishi Sunak, it looks, unless something drastic changes, it looks though he's almost certain to go through to that final two, and that would be really interesting. Being a very powerful British politician for the past few years, and seeing whether he will be that new prime minister. Who knows? We're going to find out soon, I guess.
Indeed,
So,
yeah.
yeah. And then the next person, and this is arguably, I'd say, the most interesting candidate. This is the dark horse of the race. And before this election, few people had heard of it in the country. Still now, if you go in the street and say this name, people might ring a bell based on the recent events, but still might be a bit, I don't really know who she is. And that is Penny Mordaunt, who is currently a trade minister. And she got 83 votes, which is lacking behind Rishi Sunak's 101 vote in the last round. But I think it's incredible her rise. She's now the favourite in the race, and we're going to get into that in a second. But it seems as though she's almost on course to be prime minister at this point. Yeah,
It seems, yeah, yeah.
yeah. So let's go over some policies of her. We've got quite a few here. So on the environment, she hopes for, this isn't a pledge, but she hopes for 3 million green jobs by 2030. She's pro-defense and military action, and she's actually a Royal Navy reservist, which is fairly interesting. She has quite a history. She was a magician. She was a magician's assistant in her younger years, and her, what else was it? She appeared in a TV show called Splash, which is a reality. So that's interesting. Yeah, she was a prominent member of Vote Leave, and she's pledged wider economic reform. It's slightly unclear what she means by that, but she certainly seems to have big ideas, at least. And she's currently a trade minister. She's pushing to join the CPTPP, which is this sort of South Pacific trade agreement. She's trying to get a trade agreement with the US. Hopefully that happens. That would be an incredible get for us. But we know that President Biden's a bit iffy on the whole UK trade deal issue. And she's spoken of close ties with the Commonwealth. And then on the issue of tax, unlike Rishi Sunak, she's saying raise the basic and middle rate earners' salaries in line with inflation, and that will cost £21 billion. it's unclear how she's going to fund it at this point, and that's a big issue for all the other candidates. How are they going to fund their tax cuts that they've pledged? And she's promised to slash dual fuel duty by half. And next issue is something that's really dividing her campaign. And I think this is, in my opinion at least, very petty, and it's trans rights. So she's very much trying to be inclusive, and she's come under fire for saying a statement saying trans men are men and trans women are women. To me, to be honest, I don't see any problem with that. She's spoken that biologically, a trans man might not like that's a woman generally, and that there's safety concerns in public places like toilets. But really, it's not woke. People are calling it woke, and that she shouldn't be the leader for that. That's completely petty. I don't really see any issue with what she said. It's completely plausible. We live in 2022 at this moment. We should just embrace it. You know, in my opinion, with that sort of stuff, I don't know about Unicef, but if you're healthy and you're happy, then you do you.
I think ultimately, yeah, but I would say you're right there. Health and happiness really are the cornerstones of being able to live. And I think when people don't put that as a priority and shift that to the side um, on account of bigger political topics that will ultimately come to neglect the needs of people. Yes, I can't help but perhaps agree with you there, Ben.
Yeah, like that's my sort of opinion. I know there's of course in the Conservative Party there's a debate about it, but I believe there's more pressing issues at the moment, like namely the cost of living crisis in Ukraine and everything else going on. Uh, and then she's got some problem backers though. She's got David Davis and Andrea Leadsom, two seasoned professionals in the Conservative Party. And as we said before, the polls are showing that if she gets through, she will be the Prime Minister. If she gets that final two, she will become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, someone that few people knew about uh, before this election. So, crazy, incredible rise. Uh, so many people have criticized her for having vague ideologies, but I guess that keeps her appeal broad. She doesn't exactly sit anywhere on the conservative political spectrum. She's not on the right like someone like Liz Truss is, and she's not on the left of it like Jeremy Hunt is. It's unclear, but she can. I believe, in my opinion, she's best placed to not only unite the party but unite the country. Uh, and she's also pledged a clean campaign in the face of dodgy and damaging tactics. I don't know if you've read about this, Nasif, but some of these candidates are just like some of the stuff they've done, I think is just disgraceful to each other based on the same party, their colleagues. There were digital dossiers sent to Labour accusing people of tax evasion, of affairs, of explicit photos. That's crazy. Sending that's a Labour as colleagues, that someone that could be the next Prime Minister. I just find that really damaging to the whole party and unnecessary.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, she seems as though she can get to that final two, whether that be Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, Tom Tugendhat, or Kemi Badenoch she's against. She will win that unless there's some, radical event or big story in the Sun tomorrow. So yeah, next person we're going to talk about, we just said her name, Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary. She's one of the grassroots darlings in the party, got 64 votes, and she was Trade Secretary, where she was praised a lot, and now she's the Foreign Secretary. Her policies include a tough line against Russia, diverting away from EU regulations, and reversing the national insurance hike from day one. That's her pledge. And this two of her prominent backers, and many of her backers are Johnson loyalists. So they include Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorries. Do you think that's an issue, having prominent Johnson figures that were backing him until the end, posing himself as more of a continuity prime minister? It's where many people want a sharp and clean break away from the Boris era.
I think and I think this relates to my previous point about Rishi, about how people might want to vote for him, not only for who he is, but also because he is very different to Johnson, and he's certainly presenting himself that way. He's trying to present himself as something new, unrelated, and quite frankly, something that a sharp turn away from what Boris Johnson represented. I, if I can, like, be quite blunt here, uh, I think Truss might do quite a lot of damage to herself, if anything, by trying to present herself as a continuity prime minister.
Mm.
Um, because, I mean, first and foremost, what does that even mean? That is the question that'll be running through the minds of those who may or may not want to vote for her. The second thing I think that, and perhaps is a bit more important for her to consider, that is why. I mean, she should very well be aware, really, that Boris Johnson was not popular. In fact, he is incredibly popular with almost all people from across the country, Labour, Conservative, left, right, whoever they are. Everyone seems to find Johnson very distasteful and quite clearly don't want another prime minister of the like. So for her to then say, oh, hello, I am a continuity prime minister, I'm just going to, turn away slightly, but, continue basically in the steps of Johnson with my supporters who are all fiercely loyal to Johnson as well. Let's be quite frank. The reason why all of this is happening in the first place is because Johnson himself was very unpopular. I think, if anything, her campaign is perhaps a bit of a kamikaze campaign. Now that she's trying to present herself as something as really a continuation of Johnson, which, let's be quite honest, no one will want to vote for that, or very few will want to vote for that, given the fact that the whole point of this race between conservative candidates for the leadership was caused by the fact that there was a drift from the Johnson government, and the fact that now people are looking to take a real sharp turn away from that which was represented by Boris Johnson.
Mm. Definitely, I agree. I think her. I'm trying to work through her processes in her mind. I think her hope is that she'll be able to get into the final two because we know lots of MPs are still Johnson loyalists. They backed him until the end. We mentioned a couple before. But once she gets to the final two, she could face a real hit from the members being the Johnson continuity prime minister. And I don't think that will help her in the long run. But she does have a good chance, I think, against Rishi Sunak. If it's against Penny Mordaunt in the final two, I think she'll struggle. But if against Rishi Sunak, I think that'll be a lot closer. That'll be really interesting to watch if that comes to pass. And she could get there if the whole of the rights section of the party, so, there's the Braverman supporters, the Priti Patel supporters, the ERG back her. And she did support Remain when the referendum happened, but now she's embraced Brexit. And there have been suggestions that this could happen because it's happened in previous election campaigns, that Rishi Sunak's team, if he's comfortably going to get to that final two, they could start voting for, he could, or him or his team could start sending some of his backers to support Liz Truss instead, so that Liz Truss gets into the final two against Rishi, as she may be seen as more of a preferable candidate to go up against, giving Rishi Sunak a better chance of becoming Prime Minister. And these are these dodgy tactics and backstabbings that happen in leadership races. They're not as clean cut as general elections. There's, allegiances change a lot, and there's agreements who's going to be in the cabinet, and that's why many people support them. For example, Grant Shapps, I'm going to pick on him here. He supported Rishi Sunak because he's one of the front runners. If Rishi Sunak becomes Prime Minister, Grant Shapps will likely get a senior role because of that. It'd be like what Matt Hancock did a few years ago supporting Boris Johnson, which, even though the two didn't seem to align that much. So very interesting what's going to happen. And these last two candidates, they're outsiders, unless they could have great debates. They could have a rapid overnight turn, but they're probably going to get kicked out soon. And they are Tom Tugendhat and Kemi Badenoch. So we're going to go through both of them. We're going to have a discussion. So Tom Tugendhat, he's a military veteran, and he has never held a ministerial post in his life, actually. As we said before, he's chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he got 32 votes in the last round. So really on the low end, he's very much in risk of struggling. And so his policies, he's keen on net zero, and he believes it could boost competitiveness in Europe in his eyes. He supported Remain, but now is a firm believer in Brexit. He's talked about diverting away from regulation that could unleash apparently £100 billion in funding for the UK. Possibly, we don't know. You'd have to do your research into that and lay it out more. He's also a prominent skeptic of China, co-leading a group that is, I think it's called the Beijing Research Group, that is anti-China. He's talked of a 10-year economic plan that includes cutting tax, keeping fiscal responsibility, and cutting the cost of government. And he wants the UK to be the most investment tax-friendly country within this group called the OECD within 5 years, which is this allegiance of economically important countries. He's supports using the military and public and private sector workers to tackle the NHS backlog. He vowed to continue the very controversial Rwanda policy. Many candidates are backing it, so they believe that's what's needed to tackle legal immigration. We'll see what comes to pass with that. And he's not got a massive amount of prominent supporters. He has got a wide range of them, but probably the most prominent is the Trade Secretary, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, at the moment. Many believe in he's next to drop out, but he's a good speaker. And with these debates appealing to different MPs and the members, he could get past into next round. And then the next person we're going to talk about is a rising star from the party. She is an underdog. She's a former equalities minister, and she got 49 votes in the last round, but she hopes she can do well. And that is Kemi Badenoch, who was raised, I believe, in Nigeria. I may have got that wrong, but I think she was raised in Nigeria as a child. She did her A-levels part-time whilst working for McDonald's, and she's been made popular for her anti-BLM speeches in Parliament. So policies are including to scrap net zero 2050 targets, to reduce international aid. She wants a low tax, small state government. She's a firm Brexit supporter and has spoken against subsidising student degrees with low job prospects. That's another debate we could have another time about whether we should subsidise degrees that have little long-term prospects. But as we said, that's another topic. And so probably her most prominent backing at the moment, she's got quite a few, but it's Michael Gove, real heavyweight backing from him. Of course, Michael Gove has been in government for about, I think it's, I'm trying to work, he's been in government for about 12 years now, across 3 different prime ministers, been sacked 3 times by but, for different various reasons out of his control, and he's always been brought back. He's a competent politician, and many people are saying that Kemi Badenoch is competent. She definitely has potential. And this is a question I'm going to pose to you. So Badenoch and Tugendhat, unless something changes, it's very unlikely they're going to be prime minister. But do you think they'll get cabinet roles, regardless who the prime minister is?
Well, I really couldn't say. I think, as you said, allegiances keep on changing. And as a result, so does the likelihood of each and every prominent MP to enter or exit the cabinet. And if I can be quite honest with you, Ben, I really couldn't say. But I would say, yes, perhaps they do have some chance.
Yeah, they've definitely raised their stock. Many people, well, most people wouldn't have heard of these 2 before this election, so they definitely stand a chance. So now we're going to quickly go over some ejected candidates. So Priti Patel and Ben Wallace, despite speculation, did not run. Raman Christie, sorry if I've butchered that name, but he raised eyebrows when he ran, had little experience. Sajid Javed, and Grant Shapps both pulled out. Nadeem Sahari, Jeremy Hunt, and Suella Braverman all got ejected in prior rounds. So I've got some questions for you now. Is there any particular candidate out of the ones here that stands out, whether it be for good reasons, bad reasons, or just intriguing reasons?
I think I think they all stand out. They're very interesting. Sunak, I think he's very popular with MPs, as we discussed, and he's very popular with many people. I mean, if you know, if he were to become prime minister, his economic policies are certainly unique compared to that of his competitors, and the fact that he wants to keep taxes in order to fund public services, I think would perhaps, whilst not necessarily in the Conservative Party, unite support. It would certainly support some. It would certainly unite some support across the country, or indeed there are conservatives and people who aren't conservatives across the nation who don't believe taxes should be cut on account of the fact that when we do that, we don't have enough money for public services. So I think he's quite striking, and I think he's been relatively successful with trying to distance himself from Boris. Truss, I think she's very unique. She has experience with trade and is now the current foreign secretary. She is a very prominent figure, and she quite clearly has. I mean, we can't really tell what her plans are, but she seems like an ambitious character. I think, and the other three. I mean, you know, given the fact that we've barely heard of them, but they've risen up to challenge Sunak and Truss, who've been very well known in the political game for the last few years. I think the remaining three candidates are certainly from very unique backgrounds, very different backgrounds, and while standing for different things and with different policies, perhaps overall, the one thing that all of these candidates share in common is that they are unique. They are certainly different to Boris, perhaps with exception to Liz Truss, and um, to Conservative MPs, and by extension to the people. They seem to have, they seem to be very promising. They seem to be ambitious. They seem to have plans, and it seems clearly all of them are not just there for the sake of grabbing power, but it almost feels as if they're going to be quite passionate about trying to run the country. So um, yeah, if I might say, I think they all stand out to me, and it's a very curious situation, but it's rather exciting as well. Let's see what the future brings.
Yeah, it's really exciting as someone like both of us interested in politics, and anyone listening to the show will be. For it, might be a bit uncertain over like the economic future of the country. It's certainly interesting. Yeah. So I guess that leads on to our next question. And what do you think is going to be the most important quality of the next leader? Be it specific policy, like it was a few years ago with Brexit, or specific leadership qualities that need to be had given what can only be described as a tumultuous time under Boris Johnson?
Ah, right. Okay. I think I think for many people, including myself, there's a pretty easy answer to the question. Not to be Boris. That really, I know it's rather funny to think about, but like not to have the same level of reputational damage, not to be scandalous, not to involve oneself in things that could perhaps harm the reputation of the candidate or that could harm the government that uh, any future prime minister would lead. I think the most important quality that both Conservative MPs voting for these candidates and the population of Britain looks for. I think the most important quality really is just not to be Boris, to be anything but Boris, not to be um, quote unquote a clown, not to be the in speech marks the joke of Parliament, as many people have called Boris, not to be a show, not to present yourself as if it's a pantomime, to actually say, you know what, I'm going to be prime minister, I'm going to run it, and I'm going to run the country well, and I'm going to do it passionately, and I'm going to do it seriously. That's what Conservative MPs and the people of Britain are looking for. They don't want, I think either both groups, I don't think either of them want another Boris Johnson who goes around talking but does very little walking. And if anything, does walking but backwards.
Definitely. I think all 5 candidates will, they'll all have their relative, like, controversies if they become prime minister over the next at least 2 years. But I don't think I think they'll have a lot more integrity, and I think for generations, they'll, because of the lessons learned during this, it's about living and learning, and the scandals that went on during the past 3 years, I don't think they'll be repeated. And that's why some of the candidates, for example, Penny Mordaunt, her slogan is leadership needs to change, trying to say we need a more, uniting, more like a leadership with better integrity. Although when you say a pantomime, her launch campaign video was a bit of a pantomime. It was a Little Britain-esque spoof that wasn't the greatest, I've got to admit, but she's picked up a campaign, had a really good speech. So the final question I'm going to ask you is, who do you think will win this contest? Not who you want, but who do you think will win it?
Who do I think will win it? Oh, admittedly, that's a tough question. Um, I'm going to be honest with you. I think as unique as as the three candidates that let's be quite honest, who came out of literally nowhere. Um, as unique as they are, I don't think any of them perhaps have a chance of winning, with exception to Penny, Penny Mordaunt. I think she has a good chance of winning, and I think so does Sunak. And I suppose, I really do, I suppose that perhaps it might be her versus Rishi as the final two. I feel that Liz Truss, she is experienced. She was a prominent politician for a while, but I just think her campaign of trying to associate herself with Boris in a race caused by Boris's unpopularity. I'm just going to be, admittedly, she's probably shooting herself in the foot there. Let's be quite honest about that. So I think we can rule her out, and I think really it's going to be Penny versus Rishi. I think they are perhaps the most popular, but more so the most credible. And I think the other two candidates who, as I say, literally came out of nowhere, they look promising, but to be quite honest, not many people know about them. I think one of them doesn't necessarily have as much political experience. Really, Penny seems to know what she wants, and Rishi also seems to have plenty of ambition and perhaps a solid plan. If I had to choose between either of them as to who I think might win, that's a very tough one. And I have to be straight with you, Ben. I don't think I can really answer that because they both seem very, very promising if you were to put them together in a candidate versus candidate debate. So yeah, but I think for the final two, it might be Penny versus Rishi. That's what I suppose.
Yeah, my kind of that's really good insight. My opinion, definitely think if Penny gets into final two, she will win. It looks as though she will do at the moment, but I can't help but knock this feeling that the entirety of the right, so everyone that supports Sarah Braverman and maybe some other candidates will swing behind Liz Truss and get her into that final two, and instead of Penny Mordaunt. And between Sunak and Truss, you know what? That's going to be tight. It's going to be close. I think Truss might just do it. But if I was a Ben man, which I'm not, well, it's illegal at our age, but I would bet my money on Penny Mordaunt at this stage. Yeah. So, but there are 3 debates coming, as we've said, in the next week, and there'll be many more once the final 2 have been decided. So we'll see. Lord Frost, who led Brexit negotiations all those years ago, feels like ages ago now, he made comments against Penny Mordaunt, saying she was practically useless and lazy. Words to that effect, really, and said he had to ask the Prime Minister to move her on. But then other MPs have chipped in, said when she worked under them, she was good. So who knows, really? It's people have different opinions of the other people.
It is indeed quite intriguing, yes, I
Yeah.
must say.
She has held, I think, 7 different roles within government, so she's got a wide range of different experience. Yeah. But what she is probably a big pledge at the moment is that she's saying, I am the best placed candidate to beat Labour. And that leads us on to the polling figures for today. And we're not going to use YouGov like we prefer to because YouGov haven't updated, well, they haven't got a new poll out. So we're going to use Savanta Comrades. I always can never pronounce that name, so I apologise. But we're going to go for it from their last poll. So the Conservatives got 28%, which is down by 4%. This is after the tumultuous week with Boris resigning. Labour got 43%, up by 2. The Lib Dems got 12%, which is up by 1. The SNP on 4, which is unchanged. And then the Greens went up by 1%, and Reform UK went down by 1%. I'm pretty sure the Reform UK voters and Green voters didn't exactly swap. I should point that out because I can't imagine many Green voters voting for Reform UK or vice versa. But it's interesting to look at the polling figures and what will happen because Labour, they're adamant now that we need a general election, but the candidates at the moment seem to be distant from it. Of course, both Theresa May and Boris Johnson held an election shortly after. It worked out very well for the latter, not so much for the former. And Labour have been able to dodge the whole Beergate. They've managed to overcome it now. So that's scandal-free for them at the moment, for now. And so, yeah, now we're going to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka. So if I'm correct, they imposed tax cuts just before the pandemic, and they're already in a bit of an economic troubling situation. And then COVID hit and it wrecked it. And Nasif, you know a little bit about this.
That's right. Sri Lanka, after gaining independence from Britain, was a relatively stable country. I say relatively because eventually, now, correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, there was a bit of discrimination towards the Tamils, the Tamil people who lived on Sri Lanka. They make up a significant portion of the population, and so in 1983, this all sort of built up and accumulated and eventually sprung into a civil war. This civil war would last 26 years, and it was between the government in Sri Lanka and the Tamil Tigers, who are famed for many things, not necessarily great, but who were trying to set up their own state called Elam in the northeast of Sri Lanka. The 26-year civil war only just ended in 2009, within our lifetime, as a matter of fact. And since then, Sri Lanka has been recovering. Sri Lankans today don't really divide, to my knowledge at least, don't really like to divide amongst each other. They now are united by the fact that they are Sri Lankan. And I think this was demonstrated in the protests recently with the storming of the presidential palace, that people stormed in united under the Sri Lankan flag. Regardless of what you think of those protests, I think there's a real sense of unity there. Sorry. But I think, if I'm not incorrect, just before COVID came around, there was a great deal of investment heading into Sri Lanka from all sorts of nations. One of them being China, as a matter of fact, who, of course, invests in nations and tries to set up a bit of a sphere of influence. But there's the so-called Chinese debt trap, which refers to the fact that China invests in infrastructure in places like Sri Lanka, such as ports or roads, but then proceeds to say, well, hang on, we own this now. This is a Sri Lankan port, but it's under our ownership. And you have to remember the Chinese government, for them, everything is state-owned. So even in private investment that goes to Sri Lanka from Chinese investors is going to be state-owned. And resultantly, Sri Lanka cannot profit as much as it could from its own infrastructure. And remember, it's not just China who's using these debt jobs. There are other nations that do the same. Combined with the fact that COVID hit, and for Sri Lanka, that was devastating. It's a tropical country with not necessarily the best healthcare, and is a very populated country. COVID really very much damaged Sri Lanka, and combined with what many Sri Lankans perceived as political incompetence, many of the politicians couldn't really bring themselves to sort out the economic situation in Sri Lanka. And in the eyes of many Sri Lankans, the politicians, including the president, were incompetent and very well damaged the country. With all of these factors combined with the fact that, admittedly, Sri Lanka is still, to some degree, recovering from the civil war, this really, in the last few months, really flared up and has now caused protests, riots, after gas prices went up, after food prices went up, and subsequently the price of practically everything in Sri Lanka went up. Even the common staple of your classic Sri Lankan fruits has, everything's become expensive, and not just as expensive in the same way that it has here in Britain, because we're going through a little cost of living crisis right now. No, it's become expensive to the point that people are running out of money very quickly and cannot afford food for themselves. And this eventually climaxed with the protests on the presidential palace, with the president resigning and fleeing the country, and with the prime minister's residence being burnt down. It's a pretty tense situation over there. Very intriguing, but certainly very, very tense.
Definitely. And I think there's lots of, I mean, of course, well, far away in our economic and political situation at the moment from Sri Lanka, there are a few parallels, for example, like the fuel issues at the moment. That's a prominent worldwide issue. So it's nice to talk about geopolitics from time to time, and hopefully Sri Lanka gets itself out of that crisis sooner rather than later. But I'm sure there'll be ripple effects for ages in the meantime. So we're coming to a close of this episode, and like we do, and like we will do every week, we're going to talk about On This Day in Politics. So on this day in politics, 42 years ago, in 1980, Ronald Reagan formally accepted a Republican nomination to run for the president of the United States of America. Of course, he led an 8-year extremely popular, I know it's debated at the time now, but it was incredibly popular, his running of the country. And it's very much like many candidates in the Conservative race posed, such as Kemi Badenoch having low tax and small state. And yeah, he had a massive impact on American politics, American economics, of America in general. So yeah. So we're at the end of the episode. Remember, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to this show. Reminder, we're on YouTube, TikTok, Twitter. Follow us there. And that's it. Thank you for listening. So we're going to do a little outro monologue now. For the final five, the debates await. The picture of who could be the next Prime Minister is becoming clearer. With dodgy tactics and constant backstabbing, it is still very much uncertain. Next episode, we shall know who the final two are. So stay tuned and keep listening to the show for more.